What happens when the most powerful nation on Earth enters a war it cannot control? What begins as a mission to contain an enemy slowly becomes something far more dangerous. A test of military strength, political judgment, national identity, and human endurance. The Vietnam War was not just fought in the jungles of Southeast Asia. It was fought in the White House, in American living rooms, on college campuses, and inside the conscience of an entire nation. And when it ended, the battlefield was not the only thing left scarred. America was changed forever. Welcome to History Frontline, where we examine the conflicts that shaped the United States, not just on the battlefield, but at home, in politics, in culture, and in memory. Because some wars end with victory parades, others end with questions. Vietnam was one of those wars. It forced America to confront something no superpower ever wants to face: the limits of its own power. In this video, we're going to trace how Vietnam went from a struggle for independence to a Cold War flashpoint, how the United States became trapped in a war it could not easily win, and how that conflict reshaped American politics, public trust, military strategy, and the way the nation would view war for decades to come. Vietnam matters because it was never just a military campaign. It was a collision of ideology, nationalism, fear, miscalculation, and resilience. It revealed what happens when political leaders believe force can solve problems that are, at their core, historical, cultural, and deeply human. And few wars expose that truth more brutally than Vietnam. To understand why America became so deeply entangled in Vietnam, we have to go back long before the first American combat troops ever arrived. For nearly a century, Vietnam had endured French colonial rule. Its people lived under foreign control, economic exploitation, and political repression. But even under occupation, one thing never disappeared: the will to be free. That desire for independence did not die. It grew. Generation after generation, resistance survived. Local uprisings, nationalist movements, and anti-colonial voices kept the flame alive. Then came a man who would give that resistance a single face and a unified purpose: Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was more than a revolutionary. He was a strategist. He understood that wars are not won by weapons alone. They are won through discipline, morale, organization, and the ability to make people believe they are fighting for something greater than themselves. Under his leadership, the Vietnamese independence movement became more focused, more ideological, and far more dangerous to colonial powers. Then World War II changed everything. Japan occupied Vietnam, adding another foreign ruler to an already suffering land. And when Japan was defeated, many Vietnamese believed their moment had finally arrived. At last, they thought, freedom. But freedom did not come. The French returned, determined to reclaim what they had lost. And in that moment, Vietnam's struggle for independence was no longer just a local fight. It was becoming the beginning of something much larger. In 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam independent. And in one of history's most striking ironies, his declaration echoed the language of the American Declaration of Independence, as if he were appealing directly to the principles the United States claimed to stand for. But the support never came. Instead, France resumed the fight, and the war intensified. The Vietnamese resistance, heavily outmatched in technology and firepower, adapted in the only way it could. It relied on guerrilla warfare, mobility, patience, and an intimate knowledge of the terrain. Every jungle path, every river crossing, every village could become an advantage. This was not conventional warfare. This was a war of exhaustion, a war of pressure, a war designed to wear down a stronger enemy until its strength became irrelevant. In 1954, at Dien Bien Phu, French forces suffered a catastrophic defeat. The victory sent shockwaves through the world. A colonial power had been humbled by an enemy it had underestimated. But peace did not follow. Instead, the Geneva Accords divided Vietnam into two parts, a communist North under Ho Chi Minh and an anti-communist South backed by the United States. What was supposed to be temporary quickly hardened into a line of conflict. Now Vietnam was no longer only about independence. It had become a Cold War battlefield. For the United States, that changed everything. Washington saw Vietnam through the lens of containment. American leaders feared that if one country in Southeast Asia fell to communism, others would follow. This belief, known as the domino theory, drove decision after decision, pulling the United States deeper into a conflict it did not fully understand. At first, the involvement was limited: financial aid, political backing, military advisors. But limited involvement rarely stays limited. South Vietnam was unstable. Its leadership struggled with corruption, repression, and a growing lack of legitimacy. In the countryside, the communist insurgency in the south, the Viet Cong, was gaining strength. Backed by the North and fueled by local grievances, it became increasingly effective. For American policymakers, every setback seemed to justify more intervention, more money, more equipment, more advisors, and eventually more troops. By the mid-1960s, the United States was no longer supporting the war from the sidelines. In 1965, America launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. The goal was simple on paper: break the enemy's capacity and its will to continue. But wars do not always bend to paper logic. Instead of forcing surrender, the bombing hardened resistance. It deepened destruction, but not submission. And on the ground, American troops entered a battlefield unlike anything they had imagined. Vietnam was dense jungle, narrow trails, hidden tunnel systems, booby traps, sudden ambushes. An enemy that appeared, struck, and disappeared. It was a war where firepower did not guarantee control, and where the line between civilian space and military space was often impossible to separate. American forces had helicopters, artillery, bombers, and enormous technological superiority. But superiority is not the same as understanding. The United States was fighting to destroy enemy forces. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were fighting to outlast America. That difference mattered. It mattered in every village, every patrol, every casualty report. Because for the Vietnamese Communist forces, survival itself was a form of victory. As the war escalated, so did the suffering. Massive bombing campaigns devastated the landscape. Napalm burned through villages and flesh. Agent Orange poisoned forests, crops, and generations of human lives. Civilians were caught in the middle. Families were displaced. Entire communities were shattered. And still, the war did not end. Then came the moment that changed the conflict forever. 1968. The Tet Offensive was a massive, coordinated assault by communist forces across South Vietnam. They struck cities, military targets, and even the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Militarily, the offensive cost them dearly, but psychologically, politically, strategically, Tet was a turning point, because it destroyed the illusion that America was close to winning. For years, the American public had been told progress was being made, that the enemy was weakening, that victory was within reach. Tet told a different story. And once that story reached television screens across the United States, something broke. Confidence collapsed. Public trust began to erode. The war was no longer just being fought overseas. It was tearing through American society itself. Protests spread across college campuses and major cities. Families argued across dinner tables. Veterans returned home to a nation that was divided, angry, and uncertain of what their sacrifice had meant. Vietnam had become more than a foreign policy problem. It had become a domestic crisis. Under President Richard Nixon, the United States adopted a new strategy, Vietnamization. The goal was to gradually withdraw American forces while shifting combat responsibility to South Vietnam. On paper, it offered an exit. In reality, it exposed a brutal truth. South Vietnam remained heavily dependent on American power. Between 1969 and 1973, U.S. troop levels declined, but the fighting remained fierce, and the political instability never truly disappeared. Then, in 1973, after years of bloodshed and negotiation, the last American combat troops left Vietnam. But the war was not over. Not for Vietnam, and not in many ways for America. In 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched their final offensive. Saigon fell. The South collapsed. Vietnam was unified under communist rule. The images of helicopters lifting evacuees from rooftops became symbols of more than military defeat. They became symbols of humiliation, exhaustion, and the painful end of a war that had consumed lives, money, faith, and national confidence. But the true impact of Vietnam cannot be measured only in territory lost or cities captured, because the war did not end when the shooting stopped. Its consequences followed America home. Vietnam changed the United States at the deepest level. It damaged trust in government. It forced Americans to question official narratives, presidential authority, and the true cost of intervention abroad. It reshaped journalism, protest movements, military planning, and public opinion. It also changed how future wars would be judged. After Vietnam, Americans no longer looked at military intervention with the same certainty. The conflict became a warning about escalation without clarity, about strategy without legitimacy, and about the fatal arrogance of assuming that superior power guarantees victory. For soldiers and veterans, the scars were personal. For families, the losses were permanent. For the nation, the lessons were uncomfortable but impossible to ignore. Vietnam revealed that war is not only about weapons, maps, and battlefield gains. It is about memory. It is about politics. It is about truth. And it is about what a country becomes when it sends its people into a conflict it cannot clearly justify, clearly define, or clearly end. That is why Vietnam still matters, not only because America fought there, but because America was transformed there. So what do you believe was the greatest lesson of the Vietnam War? Was it the danger of political overreach, the limits of military force, or the cost of losing the trust of the people? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to hear your views. And if you want more dramatic, honest breakdowns of the wars that shaped the United States, make sure to like and subscribe to History Frontline and turn on the bell so you don't miss what comes next. Because history is not just about what happened. It is about what it still teaches us now. I'll see you in the next video.